The story of Pavane for a Dead Princess is one of loss, death, and eventual self-destruction. It is a tale of a girl losing herself in every sense of the word. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Welcome back to my channel. Today, we're going to discuss the adaptation of Pavane for a Dead Princess in Tact OP Symphony. And oh boy, this is going to be quite the deep dive, in which I will cover Pavane's role in story mode, her tea time dialogue, her invitation and event stories, and my personal thoughts about her character. But before we do that, I want to quickly discuss the musical piece itself. Let's start with the fact that this song isn't based on a dead princess at all. The composer, Maurice Ravel, said that this piece was, quote, an evocation of a pavane that a little princess might, in former times, have danced at the Spanish court. And this song itself is a tribute to the Spanish customs of the time, and its inspiration came from Diego Velázquez's painting, titled The Maids of Honor. And while Ravel eventually became critical of this piece, I personally find it to be an enchanting and beautiful melody. It has a subtle sense of tragedy and regality that fits with the name. So without further ado, let's dive in. We begin in the chapter Interrupted Rhythm, with tact and the main 5 music arts, and for those who don't know them, they are as follows: Destiny, Jupiter, Carmen, Walkure, and Twinkle Star, plus a tag-along. This is Bolero. She's another Ravel piece and is a rather quiet and introverted character. In fact, on the train ride over, she's busy listening to music rather than conversing with others. Why are they riding a train, you might ask? Well, they've all been sent on a group mission to find Pavane for a dead princess and make her return to Symphonica. You see, Pavane is an incredibly powerful music art, but she went rogue several years ago for a mysterious reason. After being dispatched to a now-abandoned research center with her conductor, she proceeded to give them one final report and then ghosted them, with subsequent attempts to get her to return being met with hostility. This is just the latest in a long string of these missions, and Symphonica expects Tact to return with results. Given that he's the only one to treat music arts as people, I can understand why he'd be picked to lead this mission. However, once the group arrives, they very quickly realize that Pavane isn't alone. This is where we're introduced to Lyre and Dean Krauss, twin orphans that Pavane has been taking care of, and from the start, Lyre is the standout character between the two. She's introduced by jumping out of a window and sliding down a hanging vine before just running off. Dean, for his part, was trying to get her to stop, but outside of that little introduction, he doesn't have much of a focus. At least not yet. Soon after, though, we're introduced to Pavane, and she initially seems to be a polite but stern mother figure, welcoming to the group and being surprised to see Bolero after so long. Since they're both made from Ravel scores, they share a bit of a connection. But the reunion is short-lived. Pavane quickly becomes stern and cold, and she just straight up orders everyone to leave. She won't even speak to Tact when he tries to talk to her. And this change is perplexing to Bolero, as according to her, Pavane is the complete opposite of how she used to be. Bolero describes the Pavane of her memories as a cute and sweet girl with a sunny disposition, dancing for soldiers and following her conductor, Mrs. Stein, around like a puppy dog. Bolero then says that Pavane used to have a warm melody surrounding her, but that a painful one only encircles her now. After Lyre is safely returned to Pavane, to make a long story short, Lyre ran into some despair dolls, who I will call D2s going forward, and after rescuing Lyre, Pavane is surprisingly grateful enough to allow the group to stay in the research center overnight. And as the group is led inside, the chapter comes to a close. In the next chapter, titled Mourning the Dead, after entering the research center, the group is quickly herded into a room and locked inside. Once there, Pavane acts as a sort of warden, forbidding them from leaving the room or interacting with the twins. If they do either, they have to immediately leave the research center and not return. And this begs the question of why she even offered to house them overnight. And I can only assume that seeing Bolero, a friendly face, and having tact protect Lyre from danger softened her up just enough to offer them this basic form of hospitality. However, this is a key moment because it hints that Pavane acts more on emotion than she thinks she does. But I digress. After locking them in the room, which I want to mention, it's decorated for and has several signs that orphan children used to occupy it, she then says she's going to get them food, which turns out to be hamburgers, and Twinklestar is incredibly happy about it. Okay, I know that detail doesn't add much to the story, but I felt the need to include it anyway. It's a short and cute moment in this pit of sadness that we're slowly going to enter from here on out. Shortly after Pavane leaves, the group decides to do a bit of reconnaissance, finding the aforementioned signs of children living there, studying the door that keeps them locked in, a door that's sturdy enough to stay intact after being kicked by two of the strongest music arts in their group, and they speculate that the children might not have been kept here with the best of intentions. And I just now realized that I forgot to mention a specific character that's important to the story of Pavane. This is Mutar. He's a little and he's completely loyal to Symphonica, and also he's willing to let homeless refugees die. So by all means, feel free to hate him. Shortly afterwards, Lyre comes to their rescue, opening the door only to beg them to take her to Symphonica, accusing Pavane, who she addresses as teacher, of keeping her and her brother captive for years. And while she's disheartened when Tact tells her that they came specifically for Pavane, the others are fine with bringing her along. But I do want to state that there would be no guarantee that Lyre and Dean would be allowed into Symphonica, and one or both of them might end up at the refugee camp, which, if you watched my Carmen video, you know isn't really a good or safe place to live in. Despite the isolation, the research center is far safer. Sure, the building's a bit run down, but it's contained, there's access to plumbing, a kitchen, Pavane grows food for them to eat, and everyone looks clean and healthy. When asked how she came to be here, Lyre tells the group that she was brought to the research center alongside her brother and the other children. During an attack by some anti-Symphonica radicals, the twins hid in the grandfather clock, and both were terrified by the chaos that surrounded them. After some time, they fell asleep, and that was when Pavane found them. Ever since, the three of them have been living in the research center, with Pavane taking over as their teacher and guardian. However, Lyre eventually came to think of this as imprisonment, as Pavane is completely against them leaving in any way. And it's clear that this has only increased her rebellious nature. Lyre is desperate to leave, desperate enough that she begs them to just bring her, even if it means leaving Dean behind. But wouldn't you know it, Dean was listening to that, and he barges in. Dean is pretty much the ideal child that Pavane would want in this situation, being completely obedient to Pavane and even threatening to snitch on Lyre, as he believes the outside world is dangerous. But his fear comes from Pavane's brainwashing, along with a genuine desire to keep Lyre from leaving them. And Lyre's own yearning for freedom, along with the twins' conflicting feelings for Pavane, has caused a lot of strain in their relationship. Lyre often insults her brother, calling him an idiot and a coward. But once that fighting has broken up, Tact and the gang proceed to do some reconnaissance now that they're free. And pretty much everything they learned about the situation quickly starts to not make sense. I'm sure you've guessed it by this point, but the research center didn't take in 36 orphan children out of the goodness of their hearts. I don't want to say that they pulled a Playtime Co., but they sadly pulled a Playtime Co. And that's because, through their research, the group finds that the children all had high levels of alpha youth. And what is alpha youth? Well, it's a chemical that increases a person's potential to become a music art or a conductor. Given that the ones experimented on were all orphan children with no one to advocate for them, it puts a predatory light on the research center. And I want to mention that the music art transformation results in a complete memory loss of their human life, so they could have gotten away with making 36 child soldiers. But that isn't what happened, and whether it's fortunate or not is up to you to decide. Honestly, given how things played out, I just wish those kids had their parents still. But I digress. Continuing along in their investigation, the group finds a book that's essentially a symbol of Lyre and Dean's childhood, the fairy tale The Wolf and the Seven Lambs. The main plot of the story is that a wolf tricks 7 lambs to let him into their house by pretending to be their mother. He catches all but one, who hides in a clock. After the mother comes back from running errands, the 2 rescue the other children and drown the wolf. Dean explains that Pavane would read that story to them and associate Lyre and Dean with the one lamb who hid in the clock, telling them that they were quick and smart enough to survive while the others couldn't. Speaking of the other children, Tact and the others finally get to see them, because they find their way into a massive, candlelit room filled with the pictures of the 33 children. Children Pavane says she failed to protect, as she enters the room from behind them. And what follows is a very unsuccessful attempt to, at the very least, talk with Pavane. But we do come to know several things about the situation. First, she's deeply mistrustful of Symphonica, saying that they should have given music arts more freedom, especially when they're far stronger than humans. She also reveals to us that music arts are forced to obey orders given by conductors that they sign a contract with. In this game, signing a contract is a very big deal. It's analogous to a romantic relationship or a very trusting relationship. So to learn that a music art can be deprived of her consent, that can easily be abused in really horrific ways, but I do not have time to rant about that. But the reason Pavane tells this is because she has Muhtar play a video that shows the last moments of Mrs. Stein. In the video, she's clearly battered, but she spends her last moments telling Pavane that she cares about her, before ordering her to do something about the children. Due to the video's quality and the cacophony going on around them, it's hard to hear what's being said. However, Pavane interprets this as an order to protect the children, before saying that she'll forever protect Lyre and Dean, like how Mrs. Stein protected her. Tact, upon mentioning Symphonica again, causes Pavane to shout that the twins would be forced into becoming conductors and or a music art in Lyre's case, before being swept up into the war, something that was echoed by Dean earlier. But then, Muhtar butts in to say that of course they'd be given a choice. Symphonica wouldn't dare force them if they didn't want to. But Pavane rightly calls that naive. And then, she breaks down. She says that she doesn't want to lose anybody. And given how important Mrs. Stein was to her, I can understand why she's feeling so conflicted and thinks that isolating the kids is the best option. I'm not advocating for it, but I understand why, in her traumatized state, she thinks that it's the best choice. However, Lyre doesn't see it that way. She bursts into the room, yelling that Pavane is selfish for denying her her freedom, eventually saying that Pavane isn't anything to her, not a teacher or a parent. And in anger, Pavane slaps her. Which, not cool, Pavane. That's just giving Lyre more reason to resent you. In fact, we see this immediately afterwards. Despite Pavane apologizing immediately, Lyre is deeply hurt, calling her a trickster before running off. And granted, that's not that harsh of an insult, but if you really think about it, it really is. She's basically saying that Pavane manipulated her way into being their guardian and deceived them. But with that, things kinda settle down from there. Everyone returns to bed, and Pavane tells them to immediately leave in the morning for breaking their promise. However, when morning comes, Tact is woken up by Pavane of all people, and she's terrified, telling him frantically that Lyre went missing, begging him to go and find her. And this is surprising since she spent a lot of time disregarding and ignoring him. Regardless, Tact agrees, but not before he convinces her to at least talk about the future with the twins. And when the others go and look for Lyre, it turns out she isn't far. She's right outside the building, painting on a wall. And when the group asks her why she's there, she's rather bashful, admitting to becoming conflicted over leaving, and that feeling ended up growing more and more as she walked. And when she couldn't take another step forward, she did what she loved, painting. From there, Bolero convinces Lyre to talk to Pavane about what she wants, and they escort her back safely. Once there, Lyre goes to Pavane and says that she wants to be an artist, to travel and expand her talents. She's realistic enough to know that art isn't any type of a career that one can have in this war-torn world, but she mentions how art is necessary to bring joy in hard times, and she wants to share those feelings with others before she reveals her most recent painting. It's Pavane, with her arms spread outward like an angel, with Lyre and Dean resting by her side. Pavane is stunned, and Lyre quickly goes into tsundere mode, saying that she wasn't drawing her, but that she was the only model of a woman she had. But I'm sure Pavane knows that this isn't true. Lyre speaks of how she wants to see the endless sea and grasslands, the golden desert, the unsetting sun, and the dark side of the moon. But she can't do that while cooped up in the research center. Tact then pledges to hide their alpha youth from Symphonica and takes full responsibility for protecting both twins. Pavane counters that, saying that they didn't keep their past promises, but she relents, as she admits that they kept the one promise that was the most important to her, to return Lyre safely. With that, she's willing to return to Symphonica. And this, of course, causes Lyre to celebrate. She rushes to go get Dean, and when she finds him, she's falling all over herself to happily announce that they can go to Symphonica, but Dean is glassy-eyed, and he's muttering the same sentence over and over again. The big bad wolf, pretending to be mother, is coming for them. As the next chapter, titled Farewell, begins, Dean, now out of his trance, talks about a woman in his dreams who told him the sentence he'd been repeating before touching his head. He speaks of how he felt a desire to follow her and ended up here. Carmen mentions that he smells like lilies, which helps him to remember that the woman held lilies in his dream. Soon after, Pavane calls the twins to help with dinner, going all out in celebration of their last night in the research center. In fact, Pavane seems to be in really high spirits, even mentioning how it's been a while since they've had such a lively meal. Eventually, though, she winds up talking about Mrs. Stein and how she was the light of her life. Bolero asks her if that's still the case, and then, kind of randomly, she asks Pavane to dance. Pavane is initially reluctant, and the two have a little back and forth that's actually pretty adorable. And when Bolero points out that Lyre never saw her dance and that Pavane failed to teach her in that regard, Pavane agrees and calls her a smartass. And then she dances, which leaves everybody in awe, and Lyre even says that she'd never seen Pavane look so happy before. As Carmen and the others join in the dancing, Tak gets pulled away by Bolero, who has some observations to share. Namely that Pavane's melody was off while she danced. It even emitted a secretive aura of regret and guilt. To make things worse, Bolero has some thoughts regarding the final message that Mrs. Stein left for Pavane. She admits that it was a mess to listen to, and that only through repeated watching, she came to believe that Mrs. Stein was actually telling Pavane that the children had to die. Bolero also says that with the roster of children's names, only 33 out of the 36 children are accounted for. And it's at this moment that Pavane drops by, and after being briefly questioned by Bolero, she attempts to change the subject. However, Bolero is not having it, going on to ask her about the basement, and right after that, an alarm goes off, along with the sounds of rumbling coming from below. Ordering the twins to her room, Pavane rushes into the basement with everyone else in tow. Carmen in particular notes the scent of lilies again. And in the basement, standing right in front of a torn open cage, is a giant D2. Pavane rushes forward, calling him Josephus, and she's shocked that he's been freed. And as Josephus proceeds to attack the group, they have no choice but to slay him. After he falls, Pavane rushes forward, calling his name before breaking down in tears, realizing that he's already breathed his last. And at this point, Tak has had enough. He demands answers, and Pavane finally relents. She says that she doesn't want to hold it in anymore, and admits that the researchers were indeed experimenting on the orphan children, injecting them with alpha youth like I mentioned. Pavane and Mrs. Stein had arrived to take care of the radicals, only to see a bunch of D2s slaughtering all the people inside. Researchers, rebels, everyone. Pavane proceeds to take care of them before following Mrs. Stein into the basement, just in time to see her last moments, with a half-transformed Josephus in front of her. He finished transforming into a D2, but while he'd completely lost himself, Pavane conversely lost the will to kill him. Instead, she trapped him in a cage in the basement. Desperate to know how all this happened, she combed through all the research notes and realized that the scientists added D2 tissue to the children's bodies in order to artificially increase the levels of alpha youth needed to transform them. Lyre is the only child that wasn't injected with D2 tissue, and Dean was considered defective despite being injected. But with that came the horrific realization that all the D2s she'd killed were in fact the missing children, and that revelation nearly destroys her. The group comforts her in the wake of this revelation. Jupiter is livid, demanding to know what caused the children's transformation into D2s, and Pavane can only guess that the state of panic from the rebel attack was what triggered their metamorphosis. Bolero concludes that as the reason why Mrs. Stein ordered Pavane to kill the remaining children. But Pavane is horrified by the idea, understandably so, and she outright refuses to believe that she'd be ordered to do that, but she does admit that she couldn't hear the message well. Walker takes this moment to chastise Pavane for not reporting everything anyway, and must not be good at understanding the clear toll this has taken on Pavane's mental health, or the amount of vulnerability that it took for her to even admit that to begin with. And that's where Carmen comes in. Being the best girl that she is, Carmen points out that were she to report the fact that Lyre and Dean are still alive, and that Dean has the potential to become a D2, especially after witnessing Josephus transform, it would be unclear what would have been done to them, especially at a young age. I can only imagine that Lyre might be taken to undergo the music art transformation, while Dean would have been killed. That or he could become a lab rat for some sort of horrible experiment. Either way, the children would have only suffered from this revelation coming to light. Clearly, Pavane had considered these options before deciding to keep them both hidden. She even proceeds to say that the twins were her redemption sent by God, and that before she found them in the clock, she thought about unaliving herself to atone for her perceived sins. And it was all of these factors, her reluctance to let Symphonica know of her perceived crimes, her fear for Lyre and Dean's futures, and her desire to protect them and Josephus, that led her to remain in the research center for the next 7 to 9 years. In what I assume must have been a move to lighten the mood, Jupiter asks how Pavane cared for Josephus, and Pavane says that she fed him dinner and talked with him every day, which is very sweet. When Bolero asks what could have made Josephus lose control, Pavane wonders if it's because she was planning on leaving, something Bolero points out as flawed, as there's no way he would have known unless she told him. Then Bolero goes on to question who unlocked his cage, before stating that something or someone must have been orchestrating this situation, and brings up the similarities between tonight and the night 5 years ago, including the scent of lilies. Pavane mentions it, and then they hear Lyre scream. Rushing up the stairs, the group sees Lyre and Dean surrounded by D2s. The scent of lilies is in the air, and everyone is confused. Namely because the D2s don't seem to be hurting the kids, but acting as sheepdogs instead, keeping the kids together for easier management. Lyre is terrified and is shouting for help, saying that Dean said someone was here for them before running towards the D2s. And Dean is standing there in a trance, completely unresponsive. And then, the music cuts out. The D2 in front of Dean turns towards the group, and it speaks.
子供たちは返してもらうよ、姉妹たち。
Everyone is horrified that a D2 is talking to them, but the voice continues, saying that its current body is a puppet, and her real form is far away. But that's enough to spur Pavane to battle for the sake of her children. After the D2s are taken care of, Lyre rushes over to Pavane, but Dean, well, he starts to speak, but you can tell that he isn't the one talking. In a calm and unaffected voice, the thing controlling him admits to being surprised at how strong they are, and says that if it comes down to it, they'll just settle for taking Dean instead. And then, the scent of lilies once more fills the air as Dean's body begins to mutate. The form he becomes trapped in is horrifying, what seems to be a lion's head clamping down around his own, his body warping as he seems to be screaming out in pain. This art is horrific and so detailed, and you feel terrible for Dean just by looking at it. Lyre shouts out for her brother, and this seems to rouse Dean's consciousness a bit as he begins to fight back and cry out in pain. So she keeps shouting to try and get his attention until the voice cuts in again. It admits to wanting to take Lyre as well, but since she's interfering, it would rather just get rid of her. And then a cutscene plays. As Dean attacks, Pavane jumps in front of Lyre and gets stabbed right through the chest. We see her F-hole shatter, and as Lyre looks up and sees what happened, she starts to scream in horror. And for those who don't know, to shatter a music art's F-hole is to kill them completely. The voice, in response to what just happened, states that the real Dean passed out from shock, and before vanishing, it says that it's taking him to where the rest of them will soon arrive. And as he vanishes, everyone's attention turns to Pavane, now cradled in Lyre's arms. Everyone reacts differently to Pavane dying, but most notably is Bolero. Normally, she's very stoic and logical, often behaving in a detached way and quietly fixating on things that interest her. But in this situation, she's lost her composure. She's shouting at the rest of the group, demanding that they hurry to treat Pavane's wounds, and when they reveal that her F-hole was destroyed, Bolero instead demands that they think of something they can do to save her. Anything. It's just so sad, and it's so telling of how Bolero really feels about Pavane. And to know that Pavane is helpless makes it even more sad to watch. In her last moments, Pavane, Lyre, and Bolero share a touching moment together. Pavane is lamenting about her failure in protecting Lyre and Dean, her failures as a parent, and her failure to give the twins their freedom, before she encourages Lyre to go and seek her future. And Lyre is frantically trying to keep Pavane from fading away, and her speech from before about seeing the sea, the grasslands, the desert, and even the sun and the moon, that they don't mean anything if she can't see it with her. And that she'll paint much more in the future if she stays. More beautiful things for her to see, more wonderful things for her to experience, and Pavane shushes her, saying that Lyre and Dean have brought so much beauty to her already, and then the gentle sound of strings begins to play, as the score of Pavane for a Dead Princess is liberated from her body. And I won't be able to do this scene justice. The voice acting between Yu Serizawa, the voice of Bolero, Chika Anzai, who voices Lyre, and Koshimizu Army, who voices Pavane, is splendid. All voice actors do a great job in this game, but those three shine in this scene. To make the moment even more tragic, Pavane's human memories return shortly after the score is freed, and she calls out for her mother, who was actually Mrs. Stein all along. She thanks her, saying that she wanted to be a good mother too, just like her, and then she fades away, with Lyre unable to do anything but sob. If you watch one thing from this game, I highly recommend you to go and watch this scene. I also want to mention that I cried twice while watching it, but I wasn't prepared for how this chapter ended. The next scene takes place outside, and Lyre has chosen to go to Symphonica to become a music art. She knows what this entails and has left behind all of her sketchbooks and paintings. The only thing she brings with her, aside from the clothes on her back, is Dean's book, The Wolf and the Seven Kids, so that she won't truly forget Dean and Pavane even after becoming a music art. Her motive is revenge. She wants to destroy the D2s that stole away her brother and killed her mother. And then Mutar starts going on about how Pavane would have loved it if she became a music art, looking to Tact, Carmen, Destiny, and Bolero for agreement, before Bolero rightly tells him to shut the fuck up. Then Bolero takes charge, calling for a moment of silence in honor of Pavane, as that scene draws to a close. And then we get another switch and time skip. Administrator Hilda, basically the leader for Berlin's area of Symphonica, calls Lyre forward. What they're doing is called the Sound Initiation Ceremony, where the score will determine if she has the qualities needed to become a music art. Lyre cannot choose the score that she'll receive, and if she isn't chosen, that's that. To her credit, Administrator Hilda does mention that her memories will be lost upon doing this, but naturally spins it as a rebirth of sorts. I do appreciate that she at least told Lyre. Sadly, we don't see the ceremony take place, but from what's spoken, Lyre goes into a casket, having her book confiscated as Administrator Hilda manages to see it, and this little shit. Mutar cheerily comes up to her and tells her that he'll hold her book and return it to her safely. Lyre agrees, and after she climbs in, water is poured over her. And I guess that's it, because she rises as the new Pavane, complete with an outfit similar to her mother's. And the first words out of her mouth are, "Where are the D2s?" Mutar is ecstatic and responds that they're outside. Then, he goes on to ask, "Hey, what should I do with this book?" Pavane asks what it is, and he immediately replies, "Oh, okay, I'll go destroy this immediately." And Pavane, who doesn't understand what this book means to her, is like, okay. And that's how the chapter ends. And that's what made everyone hate Mutar even more than they already did, including me. Fuck that little shit. Granted, he was already shady as hell and has that whole lack of regard for human life thing with the refugees, but to blatantly turn around and destroy that one thing, the one thing that she wanted to take with her, is just... Okay, I can't talk about this all day. On to the next chapter. So, despite her featuring at the start of the chapter, she quickly vanishes as a more serious plot takes her place. We start with a scene of Mutar telling Tact, "Hey, now you won't get in trouble for not bringing back the old Pavane because we have a new one now." Not even bothering to acknowledge the woman who lost her life in front of him. But I digress. Again. This chapter is about Tact, and by extension, the audience, being forced to come to terms with Pavane's new identity, which didn't go over well with me personally. Remember how we came to know about Lyre, her passions and interests? Yeah, that's gone now. She's become a blank slate that's obsessed with destroying D2s, and she doesn't even want to interact with anyone. Not Tact, not the other music arts. She treats everyone like how she treated Dean. For example, Tact finds her in the greenhouse and goes to return the book to her. And granted, I think he could have handled that better. He kinda just introduces himself and shoves the book at her while saying it was important to her. He doesn't really explain why, but I think Tact is also grieving the loss of OG Pavane, and Dean isn't thinking clearly and doesn't want to acknowledge that Lyre is gone as well. So when Pavane refuses the book, accuses him of stalking her, and rebukes the other girl's attempts at friendship, he shouts her real name in grief, causing her to be confused. Eventually she just walks off after learning that she knew Tact in the past, and if you watched my Carmen video, you can probably guess where this is going. It's that scene. The scene where Jupiter calls Tact out for daring to mourn Lyre. Even though the reason why Lyre brought that book was so she could remember herself, or at the very least remember those that mattered to her. And I was livid that their response to Tact's grief was just to tell him to not get mad, you can't change anything, just accept it and don't think about the things that make you anxious or angry. That's what Destiny and Jupiter tell Tact, but that's not good enough. They might not be pleasant feelings, but anger and anxiety are important emotions when they aren't running haywire or leading to abusive behavior. Channeled in the right ways, they can give people the fire to make positive changes in the world, recognize when something is wrong, and stand up for what's right. So to be bullied into pushing down his feelings, and made to feel that he should apologize to Pavane when she was nothing but rude and nasty to all of them, it felt like I was being scolded too. And honestly, it caused me to think negatively of Destiny and Jupiter, and I hated Pavane even more, because it felt like I was being forced to like her on the goodwill that Lyre had created. And for Pavane, there was nothing about her that was worth enjoying in my eyes, and I refused to pull for her in the game as a result. Unless the game forced her on me, I wasn't interested. But back to the story. The rest of the chapter is about a growing rumor among the refugee camp of children turning into D2s and a silver-haired girl spreading the rumor. And it's strange, because that's something only the people who went to the research center would know, and none of them would willingly go up to the refugee camps and spread some misinformation. Skipping forward, the next chapter Pavane appears in is Girl in the Beginning. It's a small segment, and what happens in between chapters is that Tact and the others are investigating the source of the rumor and the growing tensions in the refugee camp. After years of being ignored, the refugees have grown violent towards symphonica, conductors, and music arts. They've also become increasingly hostile to children, actively threatening to kill them and even going as far as kidnapping them from their parents to keep them from transforming. They find this out from an understandably distraught mother who begs them to go and rescue her daughter. Pavane rejoins the group when Tact and the others sneak into the refugee camp. Inside, the people of the camp have children in a cage and are holding some kind of kangaroo court, as if the children are about to transform at any second. While trying to figure out which of the children are likely to transform, this dude tries to cut one of the children to see if they'll bleed. This is where Pavane intervenes, and she calls them all stupid to their faces, going on to say that they've lost themselves to fear. Then she completely shoots herself in the foot by being like, "Shouldn't we kill D2s instead?" And I let out a tired sigh when I saw this, because at this point, the refugees see the children as nothing more than D2s, and she would know that if she wasn't busy being rude to everyone. When the adult refugees continue to oppose her, she threatens to hurt them if they try to harm the kids. But from there, we have a choice between trying to talk to the refugees again, restraining them, or attacking them outright. I personally chose to restrain them because, while they didn't harm the kids, they clearly aren't capable of being reasoned with. And just as we're preparing to strike, Administrator Hilda comes in with troops and a fucking gun and orders everyone to freeze. Like a badass, she essentially is like, "I know we've turned a blind eye to you refugees, but you're going too far. Children are the treasure of humanity, and I won't let you hurt them." And my response to that was a fist shake and a hearty hell yeah. She essentially orders the children to be housed within Symphonica until they can find the source of the rumor and stamp it out, at which point the children will be returned to their parents. And suffice to say, that's what the big bad, Ode to Joy, had planned. But again, another subject for another time. The last time Pavane appears in the main story is in Chapter 12, where she activates her F-hole to boost her power. And that is her main involvement with the story mode of Tacto P Symphony. Pretty long, I know, but buckle in, because there's much more to come. So, this next portion was going to be a joke about how I couldn't talk about Pavane's tea time dialogue because I didn't have access to it anywhere. But if you know what happened to Tacto P Symphony, then you know that's no longer the case. Because in April, Tacto P Symphony went out of service. And in the rush to catalog as much of the game as possible, people made videos of the tea time dialogue. But we were also given 60 free summons, along with a bunch of other free stuff in the weeks leading up to the shutdown. And wouldn't you know it? I pulled her during those 60 summons. Yeah. So I only covered 2 of the 3 topics that I had unlocked, and I'll be going into those first, before covering what I found from the YouTuber Artipello. From the start of the conversation, she's being incredibly bratty. She admits to having no interest in talking, and only stays since Administrator Hilda told her that she'd become stronger by developing a relationship with Tact. When she was questioning again if this would help her, I decided to be a bit sassy, saying that it depended on her, and she sassed me right back, but was able to admit that since she's a novice, she needed all the help she could get. Then came the part where I could ask her a question. Between the 3 options, I could ask her about conductors, D2s, and Symphonica, and I didn't ask about D2s since I already knew the answer. because she frequently says that her mission is to kill D2s and that it's her sole purpose for existing. When I picked Symphonica, Pavane said that it was convenient, that she can improve in combat thanks to being here. She feels grateful and chooses to work hard to repay them. I asked her why she doesn't try to relax more, and she points out that I couldn't really ask that to the refugees outside, before saying that what we perceive as words as comfort could be hurtful to others. She again expresses reluctance to talk to us, as opposed to fighting, before she says that she'll give it a try for now. Essentially, she feels that even though Tact isn't reliable, she has to obey his orders and considered it a sad state of affairs. Which, rude, Pavane. But she also says that talking to us isn't a bad way to kill time, and to call her if we need her, before going into tsundere mode, saying that it's not like she's looking for us or anything. Despite that, we go up a friendship level, so someone isn't being truthful. The second and decidedly less enjoyable tea time conversation begins, as she's surprised to see Tact so energetic in the morning. And she actually seems a bit happy, blushing shyly when given a drink that she likes, before switching back to tsundere mode, saying that she's not used to chatting one-on-one, but that she'll just have to get used to it. She also asked Tact if he was caught off guard because she was on time, asserting that she's willing to help if it means defeating D2s, and encouraging him not to hesitate to ask her for help, and that she doesn't really have much going on anyway. Then she mentions the idea of talking about more mundane topics. But sadly, the only option I have left is asking her about conductors, so that is what I pick. And she goes on to say that conductors are a convenient tool, regardless of how crude that sounds. She notices that Tact's upset and asks what's wrong and if he's hurt. We're given 3 options, and between saying that we don't care if we're a tool, that we're both using each other, I go with option number 1. I'm not a tool. Pavane, however, asserts her opinion. Since conductors can't fight but music arts can, that makes them a tool for easier combat. Then she says something that's straight up horrific. She says that to her, aside from herself, everything else is a tool for her to use to achieve her goal. She asserts this about her fellow music arts, conductors, and even my own plain vessel, which is a straight up dehumanizing thing to say about her body. It's almost as if I'm not having a conversation with a normal music art. It's like I'm talking to the score of the song itself while it's puppeteering Lyre's body. Which makes it even more tragic that she's just become this empty shell, and I would argue that this makes Pavane far more dangerous in a group. After that, she actually says she feels more comfortable now that the conversation is more meaningful. And then she asks Tact to start thinking about what to talk about next time. Going to Artipello's videos, he answers questions differently, and as a result, we learn more things about Pavane. Number 1, Pavane prefers quiet places, and she considers the area around her room far too noisy. She states that she prefers empty hallways the most. Given her initial disdain for interacting with others, that makes sense. Number 2, Pavane considers resting entirely unnecessary. If we agree with her, she suggests exploring the surface together during the next resting period. She of course backtracks and says that she's joking, before advising Tact to be more careful if he plans on going on dates with some of the other music arts. After all, it can lead to problems. 3. When it comes to people she considers hard to deal with, she's incredibly opinionated. Of course, I was excited because I thought I'd get some tea about the other music arts, but instead of spilling some, she responds thusly. That is the most word salady way of saying I don't get along with anyone that I've ever seen. She then says that she knows the people she struggles to deal with, before asking Tact if he knows too. Which is not fair because how should he know who she doesn't like to deal with? But we're given options between Tact, children, and the stubborn. The stubborn, as it turns out, is the correct answer, and she's surprised that we even guessed it, equating it to her and Tact forming a deeper connection. She admits that she thought he wouldn't be able to understand her, since he gets along well with stubborn people, before saying that they will make her more close-minded. If we say children, she actually admits to liking them a lot, which makes me wonder if she'd be more fond of music arts like Twinkle Star and not music. In fact, she says that children need to be protected, which reminds me of something her mother would say. And if we say Tact, she pulls a tsundere move, saying, "What, do you want me to say that it isn't you?" But then says that he's easier to talk to than most people. And lastly, I did watch the D2 chat for the hell of it, and it went exactly as I thought it would. Now, onward to invitations. Oddly enough, the invitation has a similar plot point that appears in her event story, which is why I wanted to discuss this first. I'm going to interpret it as a sort of prologue in order to make Pavane's character progression more understandable. The invitation story starts with a group of music arts fighting in Berlin's refugee camp, and Pavane is pushing herself too hard, as another music art, Free Shooter, points out. Pavane's been bitten and is bleeding, but she's still going and brushes off everyone's concern. She's also not making things easy for Tact, pretty much ignoring him and being completely disobedient when he tries to get her to rest. After the fight, a D2 that everyone thought was down gets back up and is about to attack Pavane when Free Shooter deals the killing blow. Pavane's basically like, "I didn't ask for your help," and Tact calls her out on her rudeness, which she doesn't like. After Pavane runs off, Free Shooter notes how tense she is, and suggests ways to help her relax. Tact tries to approach Pavane in order to relay that information, but she shuts him out, just like her mother. After she leaves, Free Shooter suggests spying on her, in the name of understanding her better. I personally think that's a bad idea, but Free Shooter is based on an opera about a hunter, so it makes sense that she'd treat learning about Pavane like stalking prey. Tact then asks all the music arts who attended the mission about Pavane, and they go as follows. Jupiter says that she's not really communicative and feels that she could afford to loosen up. But she also understands that Pavane's new and probably feels strange. Spring says that she doesn't know her that well, and that Pavane outright shut down any conversation Spring wanted to have with her, unless it had something to do with missions or D2s. Despite that, Spring still wants to befriend her. Lastly, Canon says that she's often in the training room, where she hyper-focuses to the point that she ignored Canon when the latter invited her to tea. So Pavane's basically giving herself a reputation as a closed-off, unlikable brat. Still, Tact and Free Shooter go searching and find Pavane training with her fan. And after Tact tries to get her to stop, remember this was just after a very intense mission, Free Shooter points out that overtraining will lead to the opposite of what she wants. Instead of fighting without stopping, Pavane will just burn out. But Pavane snaps at her, saying that she doesn't care about anything else besides defeating D2s, yelling at them both to leave her alone before walking off. Or at least, she tries to, as sirens blare and Administrator Hilda reports D2s attacking. She even lets Tact choose the music arts to bring with him, and Pavane decides to go, again disobeying Tact's orders to rest. And since Pavane says she'll go whether or not she's allowed, he ends up letting her come with to keep an eye on her. During this battle, they notice something that's going to come up one more time in the next section. Free Shooter notices a larger D2 that seems to be commanding the others, and she theorizes that once it's taken care of, the others will become disorganized and be easier to pick off. It might also relate to Ode to Joy, but I don't know. Once their commander is gone, the other D2s predictably go berserk. And when Pavane is alone, the other music arts come to help her out, and even ask her how she's doing once they're done. Pavane seems to be touched, but she mostly brushes them off and says that she could have done it alone. And they all scold her for her rudeness. And Free Shooter then compares teamwork to hunting. The more people around, the more prey they can catch. Pavane says she'll consider that mindset, which is a start, I guess. But she still walks off, ending her invitation story. But I have to say, this makes me wonder, why is Pavane a healer instead of a magic or a fighting class? Let me explain. Back when the game was running, they had several different class types for the music arts, one of which was a restorer, and that is what Pavane was classified as, despite everything about her character showing that she'd be more suited as a blader or a magus type. I feel like it's such an odd choice that they should have worked it into her invitation story. Make it so that Pavane feels inferior as a healing class. She sees it as a weakness that she's meant to heal instead of fight, and is resentful of the actual fighters and desperate to make up for what she sees as a weakness. And that could be another reason why she'd be pushing herself so hard, is because she's desperate to be able to excel in fighting. But I guess it'll have to be a bit of lost potential. And now, let's go on to the event stories, which are my personal favorite. A Dead Princess Out of Control is Pavane's personal arc, and it's part of a two-parter event with another music art, Scheherazade, who I will be calling Zaid for short. It begins with Tact being sent to Austria, where Pavane and Zaid are stationed. Mutar, because of course he's tagging along, mentions that both of them are troublemakers, and when Tact arrives, he's immediately sent out to find both girls. Apparently when they got the message that D2s were roaming about, Pavane went to the valley where the largest group is, and Zaid to the mountains, where hardly any are. The thing with these event stories is that there's a branching pathway. We can choose options that affect the story in small ways. And here, we can choose which girl to assist in battle. If we pick Pavane, we see her holding her own when Tact arrives. She gets a scolding from him and Mutar, but it's short. After the battle, when Tact is trying to get her to rest, Pavane refuses despite clearly being exhausted. Zaid then appears, and while she agrees on Pavane's condition, she doesn't make a great impression either. Zaid is very prickly. She refuses to speak to Tact when he asks to talk to her. Nothing big, he just wants to get to know her. And she even calls him a control freak before walking off. If we initially pick Zaid, it kind of starts off similarly. We find Zaid and assist in conducting her, despite her annoyance with having to fight. Afterwards, Pavane finds us, but she's heavily injured. When Tact calls her on her recklessness, Pavane refutes it, saying that if she can't fight on her own, there's no point in her existing. Zaid just tells her to keep up the good work before walking off, and when Tact tries to approach her, she tells him straight up that she dislikes him, and when Pavane heads back, Tact apologizes to her for not being there, but Pavane says that she doesn't need any help. Later on, when she's scolded for abandoning her post, Pavane goes into her typical spiel. Her mission is to destroy D2s, and she doesn't need to justify what she's been made to do before going to her room. And Tact, despite his clear history with Pavane, asks for more info on her, and there isn't much. She hasn't been a music art for long, has an intense hatred for D2s which is considered unique, and she has a self-destructive habit of fighting until she drops. As Tact conducts Pavane in her next battle, she simply tells him not to slow her down, but afterwards Pavane has to lean on him for support when he takes her back to base. Zaid shows up, she's going to do this a lot, and points out that Pavane's recklessness is getting others caught up in her issues, and that Tact should just let her fight to exhaustion. And this surprisingly gets at Pavane, as she approaches her, basically telling her not to judge her when she skips battles. And Zaid retorts that it's, quote, no reason for going around and causing problems by actively seeking out D2s. Pavane believes that if she just fights alone, no one else will get hurt, and that nobody was around when she was fighting anyway. Zaid tells her that's not good enough. If she has to be carried home after the battle, then there's no reason to think that it just involves her. Her mission isn't an excuse not to think, to actively seek out D2s to cause more battles that will inevitably lead to more fights and eventually more casualties of war, before asking if that's what Pavane's mission involves. The two of them continue to bicker, and when Tact attempts to stop them from fighting, he only succeeds in making both girls turn on him. However, they're all at an impasse, so the issue is dropped. At least for now. As time goes on, more D2s appear, and Pavane continues to work herself to exhaustion. However, Tact is getting better at interacting with her. He even convinces her to take a break by pointing out that her goal doesn't involve mutually assured destruction, and that surprises her, as she clearly hadn't considered it from that perspective, but then she agrees to take a break. Hooray! And it's at this point that Zaid appears, saying that there won't be any more D2s to fight for the day, even saying that she'll fight them all herself if she's wrong. This marks the start of Pavane's personal mistrust of Zaid, especially since the soldiers fawn over the stories that Zaid tells at night. During this downtime, Pavane sneaks off and actually has a short reflective moment. She goes into the woods and sits on a log, thinking about what Zaid said about her recklessness causing more battles and casualties. And it's clear that it bothered her a lot more than she was letting on. She was especially bothered that she was seen through so easily, and understands that their mission is hardly a divine one, as she puts it, but that's all she has. Outside of this, there's nothing to her. And it's at this point that Tact and Mutar show up, and for once, Pavane is actually polite to him. Tact then asks her to let him know next time when she's heading out, because he was worried about her. She's confused, and Tact explains that she's not just a war machine to him. She points out that it's ironic. He's the one who guides her to fight, but at the same time, he's worried about her well-being. He agrees, before stating that it's all the more reason for him to care, as her strength allows him to fight, so the least he can do is make sure that she's okay, and then says that it must be hard for her to follow an impulse for an answer she might not get. And Pavane finds this funny, saying that he's acting like he knows everything despite not being a music art. But then Tact admits that he also lost his memories, only to wake up on the battlefield, and that he can understand her a little better now. And then Pavane actually opens up to him a little, admitting that there's a lot she doesn't understand about herself. Why does she hate D2s and want to battle all the time? Why isn't her heart at peace no matter what she does? The only thing she can think to do is equate it with her duties as a music art, but it's clear that's not the answer. Tact gives her a soft nudge, that instead it might be related to what she experienced before that, and Pavane wonders what she should do, since her memories of the past are gone. But she continues by saying that she'll just keep fighting until the troubles in her heart get sorted. And then Zaid comes out of hiding, but she seems to have gained a bit of understanding about Pavane. However, this is one-sided, as Pavane distrusts her even more now. Zaid even tells her where she can go to find some D2s. Pavane prepares to head out, Tact wants to go with her, and Pavane seems to be okay with it. Improvement! Later on, Tact is talking with Mutar, admitting that it was strange that Zaid seems to be aware of D2 movements. Pavane enters the room and agrees, before going on to state that she's hiding something. And on the other side of camp, Zaid is quietly musing about the situation, and ultimately she hates that a child like Pavane had to get dragged into this, and that she hates war because of it. Continuing with 101 Nights, Zaid's story of course, Pavane decides that since Tact can't do anything about Zaid, she'll take matters into her own hands. But her method is just following Zaid by a distance and noisily darting behind bushes when she's about to get spotted. All she does is annoy Zaid enough to go complain to Tact, and because of Pavane's actions, it put all the D2s on high alert and it caused Zaid to lose their trail. The next morning, Pavane rushes into Tact's room and wakes him up, announcing that Zaid has vanished. Worse, she seems to be actively avoiding her, and Pavane is shocked to find out that her attempts at spying were, well, incredibly poor. After they find Zaid, the two of them bicker again, with Zaid blaming her for the D2's acting up and costing her some idle time. She even demands that Pavane apologize to her. Tact once again breaks up the fight, and later on we find out what Zaid was doing. Like in the invitation story, Zaid announces that there seem to be commander-type D2s that lead the others. And this is treated as a huge revelation, strangely enough. If my interpretation of the timeline is correct, you would think that Free Shooter, Tact, or any of the others would have reported that, but I don't know. And this seems to get Pavane to back off of Zaid entirely. Later in the evening, Zaid finishes up storytelling for the night, much to the soldiers' chagrin. As she leaves them begging for more while claiming to be tired, Pavane, who had been listening along, pulls her aside. First, she questions if she was really tired, which Zaid confirms on account of Pavane following her around all day, before asking why Pavane ambushed her. And Pavane says she's here to apologize, because she judged Zaid's motives based on her own preconceived notions, and she was wrong to do so, especially since Zaid had a plan after all. But Zaid admits that she didn't, and that she just wanted to loaf around as much as possible. She tells Pavane not to make assumptions when she's reevaluating her prejudices, and that Zaid just discovered commander types while she was doing her own thing. Pavane is like, wow, I guess I apologize for nothing. And Zaid says she didn't ask her to, before remembering that yes, in fact, Zaid did. She corrects herself and says that they're even now. And before going to bed, Zaid imparts some good advice to Pavane, that there are too many things in the world to try and understand, and that Pavane shouldn't try so hard to find her reasoning for everything. Once she does that, she'll stop being obsessed with her mission. And one last time, Pavane asks to hear the next part of the story, and Zaid tells her to survive until tomorrow to do so. The next day comes, and during the battle, when Tact and Pavane are hunting down the commander, Pavane showcases some softer moments. She moves to save Tact after one D2 lunges at him, and pulls a tsundere mode when they come to Zaid's rescue. But because Pavane overexerts herself, she ends up passing out and missing the next part of Zaid's story. When she wakes up, she's very upset and confronts Zaid, who reassures her by saying that Pavane will be around long enough to hear that part again. But Pavane says no, she might vanish from this world at any time, which is just plain morbid and really shows that she knows that she's destroying herself with her recklessness but can't stop. After imparting a bit more advice, Zaid leaves, and Pavane and Tact return to Symphonica. And once things settle down, Pavane asks for a moment of his time, and she apologizes to him for her reckless behavior before asking Tact why he didn't give up on her. Tact says he's nosy, and Pavane interprets it as concern from the heart. She admits that she'll likely cause more trouble in the future, but she believes that they can make beautiful music together. And I'm interpreting that to be in the most platonic way possible because she's 15 and he is an adult. And for the last time, Zaid interrupts, having been lounging in a tree during their conversation. She says she got reassigned to Symphonica, and Pavane is embarrassed because it basically made her farewell speech meaningless. Zaid tells her to not be so hung up on it because, fundamentally, she still dislikes her and Tact. But you know what, Zaid? I dislike you too. So we're all even. And that would be all for Pavane. But I found a video showcasing what happens when you forge a contract with her. And I think that would be a fine note to end on, pun not intended. So it starts with Pavane stating that she has something to say that's only for Tak's ears, and she asks him if he wants to listen. And we can either say yes or go further, promising to keep her company until morning. Of course, if we say the latter, she'll blush while telling us not to joke around. Who would want to talk for that long anyway? Then she says that, until now, she thought that living a life in solitude was fine, but she realizes that she was wrong. Because whenever Tak isn't there, she feels uneasy, as if she's waiting for him to call her name. She seems upset, saying that she wanted to become stronger, but that she's become weaker instead. We can choose to affirm either option, but the video I watched picked the stronger option, which is good because the other is just mean. And she's glad to hear that, and feels that she can't lose when she's with him, before saying that what she's about to do will impact her battles, and it's for the sake of her abilities, before gently demanding that he forge a contract with her. He made her this way, and she won't let him refuse. After it's done, she affirms her belief in herself, before asking Tak to believe himself too before— oh my god! That's the biggest smile I've seen from her yet! But with that, I have covered everything related to Pavane for a Dead Princess in Tacto P Symphony. Honestly, before I started researching for this video, I kinda expected I'd end up hating her more. I already went from loving her as Lyre to hating her as Pavane, but instead I just felt sad for her by the end. From the start, the OG Pavane is the most tragic figure in this entire story. She's a young woman who went from relying on her mother/conductor and obeying orders from Symphonica without question to watching her mom die in front of her, realizing that Symphonica, or a Symphonica-adjacent institute, had been experimenting on children, realizing that she had murdered all those children that she wanted to protect. And after contemplating self-termination, she chooses the Kraus twins as a form of redemption, even as she isolates them from the world. And she's all alone, with no one to turn to for help. No wonder Pavane breaks down so much. No wonder she's so scared and pushes back on Tak taking her to Symphonica until he gives her a reason to trust him. Because by taking up the mantle of protecting Lyre and Dean, showing that he cares enough about them to keep them safe, and actively proving he could keep Lyre safe when it came down to it, he showed that he was someone she could rely on, that she wasn't alone anymore, and that maybe everything would be okay if she stepped out into the world again. And then she's killed while protecting her daughter, after watching her own son transform into a monster, and Lyre is left to pick up the pieces of her life. Now that I realize it, Lyre essentially went through the same trauma as OG Pavane. She loses her entire world in one night due to forces out of her control. Ode to Joy tried to kidnap her. She mutated her brother and attempted to kill her before Pavane took the hit. Lyre held her mother's body in her arms and watched her fade away. And despite knowing everything that will happen to her upon becoming a music art, she does so, to the cajoling of a little robot that doesn't care about her, that's a mouthpiece for a bigger entity that wants to use her as a living weapon, that disregards her humanity in order to get as much as it can out of her. Maybe Lyre was hoping to forget everything that she just went through. That way Lyre doesn't have to deal with the pain of losing her family, and she's also naive enough to think that maybe she'll remember just enough to fight for them. But she just becomes a tool. Still, that doesn't erase the trauma that she's been through, and it gets turned into her intense hatred for D2s. And the one person who could tell her why she's so angry and hateful was prevented by his allies. Lyre cannot find peace. She understands that her behavior will kill her, but can't stop herself from acting. And everything that made her herself, save for her stubbornness and her tsundere attitude, has been wiped clean. Her zest for art and her desire to spread joy has been erased. Hell, her catchphrase is, "My mission is to fight despair dolls," give or take swapping mission with purpose and reason to exist. She says this 8 times through these chapters, and while I found it annoying, I think I was also just really sad for her. She lost the depth that made Lyre so compelling. An OG Pavane wouldn't have wanted this for her, and I can only imagine how sad she'd be to see Lyre now. Her only comfort would be in knowing that Tact was with her. He'd protect her. He'd done so before. At the very least, I was glad I was able to see the event in a new light, because I think the events there had a lot to do with breaking her out of that brainwashed state of hers, and a lot of it has to do with Zaid. She was the best thing that could have happened to Pavane. She pushes her buttons, calls her out on her behavior, and challenges her in ways that the others don't. Before Zaid, Pavane wouldn't have bothered to do things like listening to her story time and apologizing to Tact for her behavior. So when she does, she's showing self-reflection and humility. And while I may not like Zaid, I'm grateful to her for that. And I wish we had a follow-up to see her interacting with other music arts when she returned, because I think it changed her for the better. Post-Zaid, had Canon asked her to tea, she'd accept. She'd train with Jupiter, and she'd be more eager to befriend Spring. And if I had my way, I'd want to see Pavane interact with one other music art that could bring vibrance back into her life. Who is it? La Mer. La Mer was introduced as this free-spirited artsy type, and that alone should tell you what I'm getting at. In another event, Tact, Jupiter, Summer, and Pomp and Circumstances are sent to a coastal town to collect La Mer. When they do find her, La Mer admits to wanting to make paint from seashells, and agrees to return with them only after they help her make that paint. So she's passionate about art in the way that Lyre used to be, arguably even more so. And I think she would function similarly to Zaid. How I think this interaction would work is like this. Pavane sees La Mer painting one day, when she was already planning on training, but instead, she winds up watching her swipe color after color onto the canvas, totally captivated but unable to understand why. She'd seen paintings on the wall, and she enjoyed looking at them, but seeing a painting be created was something else entirely. And then La Mer notices her. She smiles and asks if she wants to paint too. Pavane would be standoffish, of course, refusing outright as she doesn't have the time, but wanting to know what she was painting at least. And La Mer would tell her, and soon enough Pavane would wander off to train, but that has planted a seed inside her that slowly starts to grow. From there, she'd go from training and battling endlessly to slowly punctuating it with visits from La Mer. She still trains, she still fights, but when she thinks of her mission, she realizes something. The anxiety that had constantly surrounded her, it isn't there as much. It still throbs in the back of her mind, but her thoughts are filled with her desire to watch La Mer paint. Eventually, that's not enough. Despite never having painted before, at least to her knowledge, she longs to pick up a brush, choose a canvas, and sit and paint alongside her. It haunts her. She sees landscapes and she wants to capture them on canvas. She wants to join La Mer. So one day, she does. She sets her pride aside and asks for a canvas, brushes, and paint, all of which La Mer happily supplies. And as the two sit down and paint in silence, Pavane feels something strange. She feels at peace, for the first in a very long time. And from somewhere in the shadows, Zaid smiles, happy that Pavane has found herself to some degree, and Zaid walks away, satisfied. Unfortunately, all of what I just talked about will remain as nothing but headcanons due to the closure of Tact OP Symphony. When I first learned about the initial cancellation, I was in shock. And the biggest shock for me personally was realizing that this game and the story of this world meant more to me than I had realized. I mean, making Carmen the subject of my first video was because I liked her character so much that I wanted to discuss and share it with others. And while I was at work one day, I kept putting a script together in my mind and just decided to give it a shot. So losing it was tough, because I felt like it helped me to appreciate classical music more. It made me invested in learning about classical music and excited to see who would appear next. So the lack of closure was rough. And while Nike, Goddess of Victory, has come to fill the void that Tacto P left, I still miss it. And in a way, I feel like I'm keeping a bit of the story alive through talking about the music arts. And that's where you come in. If there is a particular music art you want me to do a deep dive on, leave a comment, like, and subscribe so you can see more videos like this, and even help me pick which topic you want to see next. But for now, I'll see you all in the next one, and I think I'll let Pavane play us out.